Welcome everyone to our Tuesday evening class from the Sandy Granite Family History Center. We're glad you're able to join us. I'm Bob Taylor, Education Assistant for the Center. And this evening, we are pleased to have James Tanner present to us. He'll be talking about how to use land and property records in your research. This is kind of an overlooked and underused avenue for research, but has some wonderful possibilities. And he'll be explaining those to us in depth. So we'll have you muted throughout the class, and then at the end, feel free to participate with question and answer sessions about anything that's covered or anything you'd like to know about. Thanks again, and we will now turn the time over to James for the presentation.
Howdy, this is James Tanner. Little bit of introduction. My wife and I are church service missionaries serving at the BYU Family History Library in absentia. Like everyone else, we are serving from home, and we spend a significant time doing presentations, teaching classes, and everything else by distance, so that it's been a really interesting past year. We're greatly looking forward to being able to get back in the family history centers and the libraries. We're going to talk today about using land and property records. There's quite a number of different types of records that are sort of uniformly classified as land and property records. So you just it gets to be an extremely complex area. One of the things that usually puts people off is, of course, the legal language that is involved. And I think that let me get back here just a second. I don't know why it did. It jumped like 20 slides. So let's get back to the beginning. Okay. So basically, it's something that we need to know the importance of. And I'm quoting from a book by Cornelius J. Monahan. And this was the basic law book that I used in law school many years ago. And out of all the books that I had in law school, this is the one book I kept. And it's priceless in the sense that it gives you a complete overview of the historical background of the common law of real property in England and in the United States. And it says that a thorough understanding of the modern land law is impossible without a knowledge of its historical background. That's just the fact. That is not, you just can't dispute this, because historically, all of the relationships that we have, when you start talking about real estate, the first thing you're going to get into is a tremendous amount of legal language or jargon. In other words, the things that all of that is our heritage of land. And land law is one of the many. Probate is another one, but land law is one of the most conservative areas of the law. A deed that you may have gotten when you purchased your home, or if you did purchase a home or any piece of land. If you take that deed, you can go back 1,000 years and see the same language in many cases. So this is something that without this historical background, it's really difficult. Now, what does that mean to a genealogist? What that means to a genealogist is that there is a little bit of work, and when I say a little bit, I mean significant amount of work that needs to be done as you're going through. You may need to have a legal dictionary. Fortunately, you can just simply look on Google and put in the word define, and then put in your term that you don't understand, or a word that you think has some kind of meaning, and it will give you more meanings and all of the background for that particular term. So it's pretty simple to work that through, but it is tedious at first until you start to get a feel for the language and what's happening. The next one is a quote from a famous U.S. Supreme Court justice, Oliver Wendell Holmes, and he said a page of history is worth a volume of logic. This also is a very interesting statement, and what it means is and what I think the best derivative meaning of this particular phrase is that land and property records are illogical. You're not going to see, it doesn't make sense. So a lot of it makes absolutely no sense at all. And so you really have to know the history. And then when you get that, you start to understand how all of this makes some sense, even if it seems totally illogical. So my analogy is that doing genealogical research without a knowledge of history is like wandering in a forest without a compass or a map. So if you got into this kind of a forest, for example, where you can't see the sun very much and you can't see north or south, it would be very easy to get disoriented. And by just delving into picking up a deed, for example, and starting to read that deed from say back in the 1800s or 1700s, you may get lost after about the first few lines and need to know some of the basic terminology. So this is kind of a plea to understand that the end product of understanding land and property records is really, really a valuable tool in doing genealogy. And some of the most difficult problems that I have ever looked at over the last many, many years have been resolved by looking at deeds and looking at who owned the property and who were the neighbors and who were these people. And so that's the kind of thing that's important. In addition, real property deeds and other kinds of documents can contain all the information you need to know about the relationships and the family. We have seen whole families and generations outlined in a deed. And so it's extremely interesting that you may find that. At the very least, what you find when you get involved in land and property is that you connect a specific location with an event in a person's life. The event is the purchase of property or the transfer of property or the encumbrance of property, but some event, and you connect it to a specific location because the deed and all of it deals with a specific parcel of property on the face of the earth. And then you have a date because you have a date that transaction. So with a date, a location, and the identity of a person, and that opens up a whole world of records. So many people will get to the point, they'll say, well, I just can't find these people. I really can't find these people. The answer to that question is always revolves around the place, the location where an event occurred in that person's life. And land and property that's all it is. It's all related to the location. So anytime you connect somebody to a land and property record, you have automatically answered that valuable question for genealogical research about where you begin to look for more records for that individual. So this is derivative from just what I just said, and that is you need to start your search with the locations of the events in your ancestors' lives. Too many times I will go on to the Family Search family tree or some other family tree, and I will see a name like, George Smith, and it will show that he was born in 1850 and he was born in Illinois, or he was born in England, or he was born in Ireland, or he was born in South Dakota. Absolutely no help. That does not give me any information that I can use to find that person. We don't have an exact date. We may have a name, but the name is obviously very, very common. And in many cases, even though it may not seem to be common, the name is very common. I've looked at names that I thought, well, that's really kind of an unusual name. I do a search and on Family Search, and I find that there are like 5,000 people that come up with that name. And so it's just amazingly difficult. And anytime you have a vague location like a state or a country or whatever, or a province or whatever it is, it really does not help you. So basically you have to back out of those kinds of situations, back out of the obvious that says we're going to look for this person's name in an index, and go back to their descendants, your closer relatives, back generations toward towards you, more recent generations, and use that information until you actually find somebody that has an exact place, some place that you can identify and find that that person is located with. And then you need to start again from that exact location and see if you can build a location identification bridge back to the individual that you need to identify. And that depends. It's the same process used when you work on immigration records. It's the same process you work in any real research effort with genealogical research. So now we're looking at the types of records, and rather than come up with revealing each record as I go down this, I basically, this is just a kind of a not even complete. This is just a selection of names of the types of records that have been kept and are kept. Primarily here in the United States, they're kept at the county level. In each county will have this kind of record. However, there are some exceptions. For example, we go down to mortgages. Mortgages may be kept may be recorded at the county level, or depending on the type of mortgage, it may end up in what's called the Secretary of State, or the equivalent type of office at the state level. So in each case, you may have to look at a certain location, other locations. So when you go down this kind of a list of available types of documents, it's important that you do some research. There's overwhelming amount of educational and background information that is available to explain each of these types of documents that might be found or discovered by looking in different places. It's very possible also that many of these records may end up at a state archives, or even in the National Archives. There's some records like bounty land warrants and patents and things like that that end up being federal documents and ending up on the federal level. So this is just a place to start. Now, if you were to read down this list and you said, well, I'm not sure what's meant by a patent. I really have never heard of a bounty land warrant. I don't know what a plat, or is that a plate or a plat? Anyway, plats and maps are surveys, water rights. I mean, what are all those? Well, that's what I mean when you say begin with Google and do a define, and then you'll get a definition of the term as it relates to law. And then you can go from there. So it's basically like learning another language. And there's only a small subset of the total language that you need to learn in order to do proficient research in these areas. You really don't have to know everything, and you certainly didn't have to know what you would have to learn to become a lawyer in order to do some research in land and property. But you do need to learn a certain amount of the language in order to even understand what the documents are talking about. So now, this may be a concept that perhaps I have never heard this come through a standard school curriculum. If you didn't have any history, or even some significant history about the United States in your schooling, you probably did not know that there was an entirely different way of looking at history in the United States, and that most of the history in the United States was actually had no basis in the things that you have learned about in school. You just have to kind of start over and think, Well, okay, they taught me all this stuff. How much of that is useful? And my answer is some of it, but not very much. And here's the reason. The reason that the history is that basically the history of the United States is the history of land development. And the incentive for the settlement of the country was profit from the development and subdividing of property across the country. So if you have any other ideas about how the country grew and why we acquired more and more property in what they called manifest destiny and all that had to do with the ability to own and if you're the government, extract taxes from the real property that was generated in that fashion. So what happened, let me give you an example of this. And this may seem a little bit cynical, but it's not cynical, it's historical. And the first thing about it is, let's look at the Mayflower. The Mayflower showed up in 1620 in Massachusetts colony, now Plymouth colony. And before they even got off the boat, what did they do? They signed what was called the compact. And what the compact was simply this: about approximately half of the people on the boat were pilgrims. They were the people who had religious difficulties in England and had moved to the Netherlands and then decided to come to America to try to preserve the culture of their children. That was their main incentive and their main objective in coming here. The other half of the people on the Mayflower were not religious. They were land speculators. They were people who came to America solely for the purpose of acquiring land and later using that to make money. And so they sat down and wrote the Mayflower Compact in order to sort of balance the differences that there were between those two parties. And so the whole process of the settlement of America from that point forward was based on various land grants and based on the acquisition and what we would call subdivision, meaning creating parcels that were saleable parcels that went out to people from Europe. And primarily later on, many people came to the country under the simply because they felt like it was important to be able to own land. So this map gives you kind of an outline of the original grants and the time periods that were involved in some of those original grants. Another interesting fact that you may have heard or may not is when the Mayflower came to the harbor, they realized that they were in the wrong place. Their agreement was with the Virginia Land Company. And so they didn't have any right to get off the boat or to go on the land in the Massachusetts Bay. And so they basically did that, but then had to send back. And it was more than a year later that they actually got the grant that allowed them to stay where they had gotten off the boat. So everything about the history of the United States, if you go at it from a land and property perspective, all of a sudden starts to revolve around ownership, land ownership, and who has the right to control and the right to use the property and or to sell or divide up and resell the property. Okay, so the important point here for genealogists is that everything that happened created documents. That was our inheritance from England, that the documents, the way we transferred land and the way we documented the ownership and the transfer of the land. This whole concept of land ownership was something that evolved out of this almost more than 1,000 years of English law. And once it was kind of superimposed here upon the United States or upon America, and it became the way that we now handle and how we describe and how we buy and sell our property, even up until today. Okay, so one of the things that confronted the country, the United States, and the colonies before that, was how do we sell a piece of property and how do we describe it? Well, England had a very long used type of land description, which was called metes and bounds. And the metes were the measurements and the bounds were the adjoining properties. And sometimes they were metes, sometimes they were bounds, and sometimes there were metes and bounds. Sometimes they used both types of descriptions in the same deed. Well, all of those properties in white there on the map, all of those original colonies and their extensions, like for instance Virginia, Kentucky, as it's on the map there, was part of Virginia, and Tennessee was part of North Carolina. And the other colonies, the other states have other origins, but these were the original ones. And these are called the state land system states. That means that they primarily use that metes and bounds measurement process to describe property. Now today, of course, fast forwarding to the electronic technology world we're in, we use GPS coordinates to mark the property. We have satellite images, satellite maps, and we can tell exactly where a piece of property is because we can map every square inch of the world. But back then they used what was called metes and bounds. You immediately know you have a metes and bounds map when you start hearing go 12 meters to the, or 12 yards or chains to the 12 chains to the north, to the large oak tree, then hence to the barn, and so forth. Anything that talks about how you look at or go around a piece of property would be considered to that. Well, that was not conducive to land development. That whole process made it rather difficult to develop and sell land, especially to subdivide land. That meant to split it up into smaller parcels and sell that. And so they devised another system, and that was the coordinate system, or known as the land. This is the state land system as the public land survey system. What that meant was that you went out and you started a point and surveyed that location, established it on the face of the earth, and then used the surveying techniques with first with chains, literally physical chains, and compasses and things to get the coordinates, but later with all sorts of like telescopic type instruments, and then later from now today to GPS coordinates. But it was laid out in blocks. So here's the two different kinds. So here's the state land system, and that shows you metes and bounds and how it might be described in a deed at that time. And then there's some mathematics involved in calculating the acreage, the area of that particular shaped parcel of land. And the shapes of the land's parcels are usually irregularly shaped. It's very uncommon to see one that looks like a rectangle or a triangle or anything that you would a common boundary. They're always sort of weird. And so this is the metes and bounds part of it. And then the state land system. So if you go back to the counties, to those states that are the original colony states, you will find all of the property descriptions. Now they'll have a GPS coordinate, but in old times, you'll find all the deeds sound like this. Now, the public land survey system kind of was revolutionary in that it began at a specific location of the intersection between what they called the principal meridian and the baseline. So if you look at that picture there that's in front of you, up at the upper left part of the image, you'll see a blue line that says baseline, and then you'll see a principal meridian, north-south line, and an east-west line. And then it was divided up into 6-mile townships, so 6 miles square. Why it was 6 miles? It was an arbitrary number, but it helped. And then within the 6 mile squares, the townships, there were further subdivisions into sections, and the sections were a square mile. So they were exactly 1 mile. So this is all English based, no metrics system involved here at all. This is all strictly English law. And if you go back far enough, you'll find out that all of this was based on the physical chains, a metal chain, just like when I'm saying chain, I mean like a chain that was stretched out and had a certain length. And that certain length became the standard length of the measurements, and all the things we call acres and townships and sections and all that is based on those old measurements. And then they named the townships from the upper right-hand corner of the township, and each section was named progressively back and forth across. Now, one of the hardest things to learn to read a map, a plat map that shows a property that was measured in the public land survey system, is to understand that section 14 is next to 23, not 15. Or one side is 15, one side is 13, the other side of it is 23, and the other side is 11. So when you go north, you don't go, it isn't logical. You have to have this map in front of you to understand where those lines come from. And then each of those sections can then be cut into smaller pieces of land. And unfortunately, when they get down, they may be limited by some kind of a physical obstruction, a fence, a gate, a river, a road. And so sometimes they resort to sort of a mixture of the state public land survey system and the meets and bounds. So you may find some meets and bounds tossed into a deed for public for the land. So if you want to, if you're not on an interesting, well, and then in later days, what happened was that they said, well, what we're going to do is we're going to create what we're going to call a subdivision, and in that action, a subdivision became the piece of property that then could be subdivided into smaller lots. And in that case, the subdivision was put into this public land survey system. But the lots within the subdivision were only created by means of a map of the subdivision, and they were numbered. So then you have numbered lots within a subdivision. And if they split a lot, they had to give it a new number. So it gets a little complicated. No, it gets really complicated. So interestingly enough, there are websites out there. This is one of the websites, and it's called the EarthPoint. And EarthPoint gives you a way to enter that information in the legal description of the property, either by township and range, or by land, either that or by coordinate grids or polygon area or whatever you want to put it in there. And it will then take that land and match that up to a point on the face of the earth. So interestingly enough, and it seems amazing, but you type the northwest border, the southwest border, of whatever, and then you of the map, and then the township and range and the name of the survey, and they take the name of the survey and they plot it on Google Earth, and you get an outline on Google Earth of your property, and that will then give you exact location down to the level of the resolution of the satellite image on Google Earth. for where you can see the property line running right through the middle of a house or down the middle of a street or whatever. So it's an amazing process, and it would be helpful. It's just fun to sit down and try this and see if you can work your way through it. I would suggest you get a little bit familiar with the public land survey system and kind of work that out in your mind. And before you try that, though, and here's the link to that particular website. Now, we can use these land and property records to track the movements of our land's ancestors across the country. So if your land's ancestors started in the East Coast, like almost everybody did, or West Coast, or coming up from the South, or however they came into the country, you can basically go through their land and property records and see where they lived and where they moved. One thing about land and property records that is important to understand is, unlike many other kinds of records, they are well indexed. There is no need to call out volunteer armies of people to index the records. They are indexed from the go, because everybody needed to know where these particular records were, and they needed, every time there was a sale, someone had to go back and verify that the property that was being sold was actually owned by the person making the sale. That was the job of the title companies and the abstracting companies and the various companies across the country. If you think that's recent, if you go and purchase any property in the last few years and you worked your way through the real estate sales process, and you then went to the title company and got a title to your property, and they provided you some title insurance, basically that whole process has been going since antiquity. That was the way people have been selling property back into England and back to the Middle Ages. And so those records, those property records, are basically always available. Okay, so, but this is an interesting kind of map. And why this is an interesting kind of map is it's called a cadastral map. And what it means, the word cadastral means, is that it was made for the purposes of levying taxes. So ownership was extremely important, because the governmental agencies needed to make sure that they were taxing the right property, the right amount of property, and the right owner of the property. And so all of those things are extremely important. Now, let me give you a little bit of a hypothetical right here so you can begin to understand what I'm talking about here at this process. Let's suppose that you are doing some research in your genealogy, and you go back and you're to some county like Alachua County in Florida, or Grayson County in Texas, or some other county out there. And you get back to doing the records, and there don't seem to be any records that you have any available in the big websites, Family Search and all of that. And you go back, you go to the county, you call the county, you say, okay, well, we'll just ask the county where the records are. So you contact the county and they say, oh, well, the records you looked for were burned. The county burned back in 1910, or burned in 1840 or 1860 during the war, or whatever. And we don't have those records. And that is not correct. That is simply not accurate. What would happen if the county courthouse burned down and the land property records were lost? All of the people in the county get to live tax-free for the rest of their lives because there's no record of who owns the property, so the county can't levy any taxes? Think about it. Think about it for about 10 seconds, and you'll realize, wait a minute, somebody has to determine who owns all that property. And the answer is all along, for as long as there have been records kept in the United States, there have always been private parties who were not part of the county and not part of the government, whose job it was to research the ownership of the property. Back east, they're called abstractors, abstracting the property. In the West, they're called title officers. And the title people and the abstracting people have their own records. They do not rely on the counties. They rely on their records. They may grab copies from the county, but they create what they call their plan, their set of documents. And so as soon as there was a fire, within a matter of a very short period of time, the county needed money. They basically then would go out and go to the populace and say, we need copies of your deeds. We need copies of all the records that you have. And they would reconstruct all of the property records, because I can assure you that every county, regardless of when that was burned, has still levies taxes on the property that's owned within that county. Okay, so there's the records may not be detailed enough to give you the owner that you're looking for, because that's always possible. It's always possible that that particular record was mislaid or was not reconstructed, but the actual ownership of the property and the title, called the title chain or chain of title of the property, is always available no matter where you go in the country, regardless of those Burke County history issues. Now, if there are breaks in the ownership of the county, then there had to have been some type of action taken to determine who was what the description of the property was and the ownership of the property, and that had to have been reinstigated or reinserted into the land and property records. Okay, so that kind of gives you an idea of what's going on and what the importance of all of this is. Now, interestingly, there are cadastral maps all over the United States. And here's another very important key about this. Even though we can go on Family Search and Ancestry and MyHeritage and a few other websites and find land and property records in categories. The people who create these records and the people who store and index these records and use the records on a daily basis do not characterize these records as genealogical records. These are not genealogical records. They're land and property records. And the fact that genealogists are able to use the records is just like, well, so kind of a situation. It's really not important to them that they have genealogical significance. It's not even a thought. It has to do with taxes. It has to do with ownership. It has to do with a lot of other political things that are going on. For example, we just went through a national election, and one of the basic issues that raises in every national election every 4 years and every local election that ever happens is the districting and the maps that are drawn that include certain areas under certain jurisdictions of the representative government. Okay, so all of this basis revolves around property and around land and land ownership and land control. Okay, now here's a map, and this is another cadastral map, and this one happened to be. Now, where are these maps? Simply, go on to Google, and this word, cadastral, is a word. And you put down cadastral maps, and you put your location where you want to find the maps. Okay, you want cadastral maps in Ohio. And then you will find a number of places, usually on a county basis, of repositories. And there has been a significant effort to digitize and organize and make searchable all of these maps on all over the United States, having nothing at all to do with genealogy. It's got nothing to do with Family Search or anything or anything else. It's not Ancestry, it's not anybody. It's just, this is being done to make the lives of the county clerks, the assessors, and the recording, the county recorders, and all of the other people who deal with the land and property records lives easier, and the title companies and the abstractors. And so all of these all these indexes are available. Okay, so here in Utah, for example, we happen to be here, and I'll use that as an example. I live here in Provo, in Utah Valley. Presently in Utah Valley, I can go on to a Utah Valley map, and I can then do a search, and I can drill down and see the ownership or the chain of title of every piece of property in Utah Valley for free online by my looking for it. That's it. And I can do that all across the country. Some places are just now catching up, and there are some counties where it hasn't happened yet. But by and large, that's fairly, I've watched it happen. A few years ago in Massachusetts, there were almost no maps online. Now, centralized, most of the property maps in Massachusetts are now online. And they usually have digital copies of all of the documents, and they have very detailed maps that are drawn using, and this is another just a piece of information, that's called the CIS system, the CIS mapping system, and it's a common system used for mapping online all the way across the world. And so what we have is kind of a way to look at all of this stuff. So this is a cadastral map, and you should be able to find this. And the ones that show up on a search here in Utah Valley and across the country, and I happen to be involved in selling some land in Arizona. And so I'm looking always at Apache County's maps, and I can drill down and see every parcel of every map and every owner and every chain of title and who owned it for Apache County back to Pioneer days. So there's no way I can see everybody that's ever owned a piece of property from the day it was that it became created. And you can imagine now, if you think about it, that this has got to have a lot of genealogical information involved, and to know who these people, and being able to identify these people. And here's another map. This is a more detailed part of a cadastral map in Pennsylvania, and you'll see the people who owned it, and it actually shows on the map the location of their residence, of their farmhouse. And so this can be, if you take this map and you look at it, and there are programs that allow you to actually overlay this map onto Google Earth and see, sort of transparently see how this map matches up, and you can size it down so that the two hills that are shown there match up the hills, and then whatever, or the lakes or whatever. And then you can see exactly where this original property was, which enables you to then see how very important information about your ancestors. And just kind of an illustration, as I'm hiking around in the mountains, I came across this little marker sitting in the ground in Rock Canyon, east of Provo. It was the Department of Agriculture's U.S. Forest Service cadastral survey. Now, why would the Forest Service have a cadastral survey? The same for everybody else is, to find out who owned the property and make sure that they owned it and that they had the control of it. So in the United States, deeds and other land records are usually found in the individual counties. And I gave a picture here of Texas because they have probably the most counties in the United States. And they're sort of arbitrarily, but you'll notice for the most part, with some exceptions on the western edge of it, is that these properties are all aligned on the public land survey lines. Now, it may not look like that because some of them are an angle instead of straight, but when they did the angle lines, they simply calculated it across, and they showed that as part of the land survey. So they're really not meets and bounds. They're really all tied into the surveys. Now, important to also understand that some of the U.S. federal census records will tell you whether or not your ancestor owned land, whether they were a renter or whether they owned it. And so here's a copy of the 1900 U.S. Census, and it asks for can they read, can they write, and they owned or rented the property, or was it owned free or mortgaged, and how many years they'd been in their home, and the number of farm schedule, meaning there's separate farm schedule ownership schedules in some of the years. So there's a way where you immediately know there's a farm. You should be very interested in this because, well, one thing is that a lot of people buried their families on their farms. So you may find a cemetery by doing that. So there's some real connections here. Now, as is the habit of large governments or governments in general, they have a claim to some of the property, the land that is part of where the government resides. In England, all of the land in the country was owned by the king, period, end of story. The king owned everything, and everybody took subject to the king's ownership. That has been modified over the years, over 1,000 years from the earliest days. But there are still quite a bit of semblance of that in the way the law works in England. The federal governments in the United States, of course, didn't have kings that they had been given property in America. But when they broke from England, then there was a question about ownership. And that's why we have the state land system in the East, because then the states themselves claimed the land individually. And then the federal government basically got their land by buying it. And so the federal government went out and did the Louisiana Purchase and all of the other purchases and wars and accessions until we have what we have now in the United States of America and the land that we have here. And that starts out being all federal land. And if you live in a state like Utah or Arizona, you're painfully aware of that because the federal government owns the majority of the land of the state. And the state government owns the rest of it, and the private ownership percentage is rather small in both states. I think the state that has the smallest amount of private ownership is Nevada, but I'm not sure. I think that's the last time I looked. But Utah's pretty close. Now, once the United States had the property, then they understood that it was a really good idea to raise money by selling it off. And when they sold it off to people, they created, beginning in 1862, they began to do that. And why is it in 1862? Because the government needed money because it was fighting a war. And so it began the process of selling off the public land to whoever had the money to buy it. And that was a way to transfer the money from people into the federal government. So the federal government had an income and had a way to maintain itself. And so they sold land off. And there are a very complicated series, by the way, of Homestead Acts that were passed. And the earliest Homestead Acts were in 1862. The last Homestead Acts were in Alaska in 1968, around that time period, 66, 67, 68, somewhere in there. Where did all this land come from? What was the process? Well, they created an office, a part of the government called the General Land Office. And the General Land Office is the entity, or is still the entity. They still sell land. But the General Land Office was and is the entity that sold all the property. They're the agency that sold the property out to the homesteaders. So the homesteaders made applications. They provided improvements. They had to go through a process over a matter of years. And at the end of that, they got a deed to the property, and that deed was called a patent. And so they got a federal land patents. All these patents are located and they're available online. And as a matter of fact, there are websites out there. Some of them are for sale, I mean, subscription websites that will tell you the original owner of every parcel of property in the United States under the state land, under the public land system. So, and a lot of them under the meets and bounds system in the East. So that's something that's available. In fact, there's a website in the BYU Family History Library that has that as part of. You can use it for free in the library. Unfortunately, we're not in the library, so we can't use it at the present moment. But it's out there. Bounty land warrants, on the other hand, were another way of using the government's land to raise money, and that was when people fought in the wars, the Revolutionary War, beginning with the Revolutionary War and ending with the War of 1812. They began to give people, instead of paying them with cash or with coins that would have some actual value in the sense of being scarce national resources, they would give away land, which they had plenty of. And so what would happen is that a military veteran, instead of getting a check of cash or gold or whatever for his service, would get a piece of paper called scrip that would say that he had a right to a certain amount of land, which depended on his rank in the army. And those land warrants became able to be sold and bought and sold like on a stock market. They came like stock, you could buy and sell them. Some people redeemed them and got their property and lived on it. Some people just sold their warrants and made money that way. So they were the Revolutionary War between 1789 and 1833, and the War of 1812 between 1815 and 1858. And I have basically had situations where these showed up as the original 1812 land warrants as late as 1930s. So, these are kind of an important issue in land ownership in the United States. So you can create a chain of title or ownership of a piece of property and can be used to go back generations of your ancestors. You can find out where all your people live and go across by looking at the land records. And that will give you a firm anchor into what you know that you've got the right group of people. So it's just a very important thing to look at. So here's, for example, an abstract that's online for free of a piece of property in Provo, Utah, with the property address. And it shows you the legal description, which is kind of a mixture of the public land survey and meets and bounds with curves and things. And then it shows you all of the people who owned that piece of property up to the present. And Union Pacific Railroad was the first person to get it, and their grantor, the person who gave them the property, was the federal government. So you can look this up on many counties in the United States. You should just go in and kind of search around. Not in genealogy records. These are land and property records, and you have to go to the county assessors, recorders, and treasurers' offices and look at their maps. Here's the parcel viewer map for Apache County in Arizona, and I use this frequently because of the land that my family and others own in this particular area. The land warrants and the bounty land warrants and the Homestead Acts are either in some part of the federal government in the National Archives, or they are in state archives, historical societies, museums, and libraries. These can be almost a lot of different places, so you need to track these records down. And when you get lost, it's very possible you could, if you can, if you make friends with a lawyer that does real estate transactions and does real estate law, they might be able to tell you where all of this information is by just sidestepping it all. But you can always go to your counties, county recorders, and ask them about the records. Title companies and abstractors, I've already talked about that. Here's an abstract of title that was compiled back many years ago. And you'll see up there, it says the southwest quarter of the southeast quarter of this section 7, township 118, range 28. Don't forget the large online genealogy family tree websites. They have a lot of land and property records, and some of those are actually indexed. So you might be able to find some of those. Always be ready to find that when you find the original records that were digitized, that they may already have digitized an index created by the county with those records. So you might want to look for that. So here's the ones you can use to get some of those records, the usual large online databases. Now, where do we go to get started? First thing I would suggest is to look at United States Land and Property Records under the Family Search Research Wiki. You go to the Research Wiki and put in United States, and then over on the right-hand side, you'll see a list of the types of records, and then just click on Land and Property, and you'll be right into this beginning of a very detailed explanation of all that information. And if you're if you really want to get started in a way that's organized and step by step, you go to the Family History Guide, and for each of the states in the United States, you will find and each of the counties, you will find a section about their land and property records. So you can get there pretty quickly and find some information about all the places and things that I've been talking about. Also on the BYU Family History Library YouTube channel, because of my background in real estate and real estate law, I have over the last few years done quite a few different presentations, including this one on the BYU from the BYU Family History Library. Okay, well, thanks for watching. And there's a little bit of land there in Utah County right there with all the property. You can see the property, and if you know what you're looking at when you look at a picture like this, you can actually see where the parcels are, and you can begin to, instead of looking out here and seeing this lovely valley with clouds, you're looking at real estate, and you're seeing all the buildings and the land and who owns what and all that kind of stuff. So that's what it does. Okay, anybody got any questions out there? Did I lose everybody?
No, we're still here. James, that was wonderful. A great amount of detail, and I like the way you weave together the practical aspects and the terminology and the history, all very fascinating.
It gets much more fascinating. The interesting thing is, for instance, where did I get this? Well, obviously I had to take it in law school, but I grew up with it because my father was an attorney, and we were always involved in land and real estate. And so it was just part of my background, was just real estate. And so I felt a great affinity for real estate when I took land and property courses in law school. And obviously, because I practiced with my father off and on for many years, he was always involved in real estate, and so that's what I ended up doing for almost 40 years, was just real estate. And what was interesting about that was that if you really want to get into places where people love to fight, it's real estate. I mean, there is nothing more. You can't, I mean, the last case I had after being in law I retired after 39 years. The last 15 years, there had been a case that was about real estate that had been in court for 15 years. with a total of 30 lawsuits filed in that one single subdivision problem. And all of those were resolved, and I finally took it to the Arizona Supreme Court and got rid of it. And I had to wait until the court decided that case before I could retire, because I was the guy named on it, and nobody was going to take over a case that had been in the court for 15 years. And so the week that the Supreme Court ruled in my client's favor on that case, I retired. Didn't do me any good, because I still owned a lot of land, and I still have to be involved in all the I've still been involved in litigation for the last 10, 15 years, for more than 10 years. No, actually, I've been involved in litigation since 1998. So anyway,
Any other
Any-
questions for James?
anything. You want to know what your house is worth?
See all the things you learn in these Tuesday night classes. Amazing.
No, I mean, you may think I'm kidding. I can tell you how much your house is worth in about 10 minutes, about 10 seconds. So,
Another 10.
Yeah,
I had been able to, yeah, this is Sean Hewlett. It's kind of funny that you mentioned that cadastral survey, 'cause I
mhm.
actually found one on some property